Good morning, Bride of Christ. How are you? That was decent for you people on a wet Sunday morning. I can do things scared. That'll come up in a little bit, Amethyst. About 6 months ago, my unbelievably strong mother called me up on the phone, and she said, "Hey, I have a favor to ask." I said, "Sure, what's your favor?" And she said, "Would you go to the crematorium for me? I want to pay for your dad and my cremations, and I want to get all the paperwork out and get it all paid for. We could feel my dad's life kind of coming to a close." And I said, "I'd be thrilled to do that with you." So we went to Hull's Crematorium in Walnut Creek. Anybody familiar with Hull? It's been there for like 4 generations. I mean, it was a weird deal, man. There's no other way to say it. My mom and I were there for 2.5 hours. We're filling out this questionnaire. This guy's asking us all these questions. I won't share with you all the things because I don't know that my mother would appreciate it, but we were cracking up at times together. It was just this really sweet time with her almost 60-year-old son and an 88-year-old mother talking about what to do. And at one point, I will share this, so if she gets mad at me, she gets mad at me, but she'll get mad at me. And the guy said to her, "No, I need to know where you're going to spread the ashes." And my mom said to him, "I'm not going to tell you." And he looked at her all confused, and he said, "Well, I just need it for the paperwork." She goes, "Well, I don't want to tell you because I'm not sure it's legal." And at this point, I'm super intrigued, and I'm already having one of the best times of my life because I'm at a crematorium. And he says, "Well, this is like attorney-client privilege. I can't share what you share with me," which I totally don't believe, but whatever. He got her to say it. Yeah, exactly. So she says, "Well, I want to spread Norm in the backyard." He goes, "Oh, that's great. People do that all the time. It's fine." Then he says this, "Just don't dump him in a clump because the sprinkles will hit him and it'll get all cloddy." And my mom says, "Okay, we'll make sure we fan him around." And I'm sitting in this conversation, I'm thinking, this is the weirdest conversation I've ever had. And I've had a lot of weird conversations. Death is so strange. Death, to me, is the most familiar, strange thing in our lives. I've shared many times up front how much I am moved when I go to a memorial service. And I'm moved either way, because I've been in some where it's just like, oh, this is awful. This is no way to live. I remember going to one memorial service where there wasn't a single thing said about the person in the last 40 years, because there was nothing good to say. It was tragic. But I've been to a lot of great memorial services too. Many of us were at Tom Heathorn's memorial service just less than a month ago, probably just 2-3 weeks ago. And I wasn't there, but I was told later, Steve and Sally Beck were there. They used to go to our church, and very godly people. And Steve had a group of people around him, and he said, "Okay, everybody get in a circle. What's your takeaway?" And I had already done that, and I do it every single time. And the word that I walked away from Tom Heathorn's memorial service was present. People just kept saying this over and over. He's always present. He's always present. And I don't feel this way about myself. So it's like, God, I can tell you're trying to stir something in me. There is much to be gleaned from death. It's a temperature check, I think, on our life. There is much to be gleaned from Jesus' death. Specifically his burial, which is what we're going to look at this morning as our study in John is coming to a final conclusion. So this morning what I want to do is I want to, in a sense, imagine ourselves attending Jesus' memorial service to see what we can glean. And I want to look at 3 areas and then let them kind of bounce off of our hearts and minds and souls to give us a temperature check. And each one is going to get a little more personal as we go. We're going to start with kind of what the situation is at his burial, which won't be very personal at all, but I think it's very, very important to understand the setting. And then we'll learn about this Nicodemus guy and this guy named Joseph of Arimathea that we only see show up at the burial scene, what we can learn from them. And finally, we'll get very personal and we'll talk about what we can learn about the kingdom from Jesus' burial. So let's start with kind of the scenario, the situation. by kind of looking at this passage this morning. And there are several things. There's 4 things of importance that I want to at least highlight what Amethyst just read for us. First of all, this kind of push for the removal of the bodies. You can feel it when you read the passage. When Amethyst just read this, you can feel this like, we need to get this thing moving quickly. The Judeans wanted the bodies taken down from the crosses quickly. And it's an obvious reason. The next day was Sabbath. And that was significant enough, but this is more than Sabbath. This is not only Sabbath, this is Passover Sabbath. And it specifically states, believe it or not, in the Torah, if you don't know, is the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the books of Moses. It states in the Torah in Deuteronomy 21 that when you have an executed person, believe it or not, this is how specific the Torah gets, you should not leave them hanging overnight, or it will pollute the land. It will make the land unholy. So they knew when they executed somebody, they had to take them down from something like this, which I think is kind of sadly comical, because apparently killing an innocent man, let alone killing God, does not do anything to the land at all, which is just ridiculous, right? It's the insanity of religion. When you make your perfection more important than the perfection of God. Never trust somebody that says they are part of the faith when all they talk about is their faith and their walk and not what God is doing, has done, and is doing. Second of all, crucified people often didn't die on their own on the cross. Pilate sentenced Jesus to be executed, not just tortured. And quite often, this would go on for days and days. But again, Passover and Sabbath loomed, and it called for a quicker end. And the Romans didn't want this to go on either, by the way, because they didn't want to disrupt the Jews on their Sabbath. So they wanted to end this quickly as well. Excuse me. I've shared this before, that part of the punishment of crucifixion was that when you see pictures and movies, they often depict the legs straight and the arms straight, but this is not at all accurate. What the Romans would do, because they perfected it, was they would bend the legs on the body and then drive the spike in. And so the person would be collapsed forward with their chin literally hitting their chest. And if you've ever done this, like I do yoga 3 days a week, and when you do that kind of cat-cow thing and you pin your chin to your chest, it's hard to breathe. And the reason they did this was they were trying to suffocate the victim. And so the victim would have to straighten their legs and arch their back in order to get a breath into their lungs. And in so doing, they had to drive down on the spike on their legs to get a breath of air. And finally, when they were too exhausted, they would give up. And they would suffocate during that time. How much more wounded must Jesus have been that when they go to end this thing, they pierce the guy on the left, they pierce the guy on the right, but they notice Jesus is already dead. They went to the cross at very similar times. It tells you how beat up Jesus was. So they did not break his legs to foster the suffocation, but they did pierce him to make sure that he was dead, and unknowingly fulfilled prophecy from the Old Testament. In Zechariah 12, it says this, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleased for mercy, so that when they look at me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him, as one mourns for an only child and weeps bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn." This is over 500 years before Jesus, by the way, exists on this earth. Third, the result to the body. After death, the body fluids separate. We don't know actually if they pierced him in his heart or where they pierced him. But the point is, whereas a living body, if you pierced it, blood would gush out. in a body that is done, it is dead already, either from the chest or the stomach, it would produce a mixture of clotting blood and a fluid-like substance, like water. So you would literally see water and blood coming out. The point is, Jesus is dead, and yet again, on the cross, dead. Echoes of water and blood, even after he dies, come out, of both cleansing and purification. Every time we see water and blood, this is what it means. It means cleansing and purification. Even in his deadness, Jesus can't help but cleanse and purify. And of course, the Torah specified that the lambs that were slaughtered for atonement on Passover could not have a single bone broken. And once again, prophecy is fulfilled on the cross. And finally, the process. They didn't use coffins or cremation like I opened up with. They hollowed out caves large enough, by the way, for 2, maybe 3 people to go in and work. And they had a very, very low doorway, normally no higher than 4 feet tall. And the reason I'm describing this now is it'll be very important when we look at the passage next week, when Mary Magdalene comes to the empty tomb. And then she goes and gets John and Peter, and they run to the tomb. This imagery will be important. The bodies were first laid on a ledge to decompose because they were family tombs. And when they were decomposed, they would remove the bones and place them in a small box called an ossuary. And in between burials, they would secure the cave from robbers because often they would lay things in there of worth. And so they would roll these large stones in front that were insanely difficult to move. And it dispels this crazy notion that I've read many times that, somebody just went in and stole the body. First of all, a person or 2 alone could not go and roll these stones away. Second of all, the Romans knew that somebody might do this to feign a resurrection, so they placed guards there. So that's kind of the situation. Well, what can we learn about these 2 interesting fellas, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, from the burial? What do we actually know about this fascinating person, Nicodemus? I love this guy. And for those of you, how many of you are watching or have watched The Chosen? A lot of you. It's worth watching. I mean, it's very worth watching. He'll be the most likable Jesus you've ever seen. He'll actually match Scripture, quite frankly. But Nicodemus plays quite a part in this. And he should sound familiar to us because we've come across him 2 times already in the Gospel of John. And you can tell he's significant to John, right? Because John keeps highlighting this guy, although he doesn't seem that important to the story, he is to John and obviously to Jesus. We haven't met this Joseph of Arimathea character yet in John, but he does show up in all 3 of the other Gospels. The other Gospels teach us Joseph is actually the one that owned the tomb that they laid Jesus in. And just as a side note, the text said that the tomb had never been used. Why do we need to know that? Why would John write that? It's such a weird deal because the skeptics like to say that maybe they went to the wrong tomb and didn't know where Jesus was laid. Therefore, if they went to the correct tomb, then they would have found his body there. But this is a tomb that had never been used. And what John is trying to tell us is Joseph of Arimathea knows exactly where this tomb is, and I know where this tomb was because it had no stone in front of it before Jesus was laid in there. This is a brand new tomb. And Joseph, remember, this Joseph of Arimathea is a member of the ruling Sanhedrin underneath the oversight of the Roman government. There were only 71 sages that were a group that belonged to the Sanhedrin. And they were the religious elite of all of Judea. And Nicodemus is also one of the 71 sages. These are learned men. These are men that had memorized most of the Old Testament, by the way. So these are dedicated, religious, well-known men, not just in Jerusalem. They were famous everywhere they went. There were only 71 of them. Only John's gospel tells us that along with Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus helped. The first time we saw Nicodemus was in chapter 3, and then we see Nicodemus again in chapter 7. Jesus' nighttime visit in chapter 3 is his first kind of extensive conversation with someone recorded in the book of John. And it's quite a conversation. I don't know if you remember the conversation. Do you remember in John chapter 3, without peeking, do you remember what Jesus tells Nicodemus? He must do something. Something must happen to him. Do you recall? You must be born again. This is where our phrase comes from. He is at the top of his profession. He is at the top of his country. Yet he comes to Jesus and calls him Rabbi in chapter 3, which is very strange because Jesus has not worked up the ranks properly to be a rabbi, and yet he humbles himself in Jesus' presence, which honestly tells you a lot about Nicodemus. He knew something spiritual when he saw it. And Jesus tells him what? You have to start over. Of all people, he tells one of the 71 religious faith sages, you must start over. Something has to die and be reborn. Jesus' salvation is through death. Death to the ego. Death to self-sufficiency. Death to your own rights and desires. They all need to die. Children are born through pain of another, through blood and pain. And so we must be born in the Spirit the same way, through Jesus' death and through his pain and through his blood. And then in chapter 7, there's the Feast of Booths. I don't know if you remember this scene, but Jesus is in Galilee, and his earthly brothers say, hey, we got an idea. We want you to go down to the Feast of Tabernacles with us in Jerusalem so you can finally really get popular. You're kind of popular up in Galilee, but that's not good enough. Let's go get popular in the capital. Let's go to Jerusalem. And Jesus says, I'm not going because that's not why I'm here. So the earthly brothers leave and they go to the feast. And then what the scriptures say in John chapter 7, it says, then Jesus waited till they left, and then he went down south to Jerusalem in secret. And then, I don't know if you remember the study, in secret, mind you, he marches into the temple and the Feast of Tabernacles when all of Jerusalem is packed and the Temple Mount is packed, and Jesus stands up on a milk stool and starts to preach, drawing all this attention to him. And that's when Jesus gives the famous statement, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me, and I will give him living, rivers of living water will flow out of them. And then we have interaction number 2 with Nicodemus and John 7:50. Nicodemus, who had gone to him before, that's chapter 3, and who was one of them, that's one of the sages, said to the other sages, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? But they replied, are you from Galilee too? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee. It's interesting, right? Now Nicodemus, having weathered, watched Jesus all this time a bit, and he had this weird interaction about being born again that he clearly did not understand, right? Now he hears Jesus and he's defending him to the other sages, to the point of taking flack from the other sages in the Sanhedrin. And that's it. That's all we know. That's all John gives us. A conversation that looks like it goes nowhere in chapter 3. And then this slight defense of Jesus in chapter 7. And then silence until now. And here's the key. Joseph is willing to spend his money to bury this rabbi, Jesus, and Nicodemus is right there too. So then what can we glean personally about the kingdom from this? We're at the memorial service, remember, of Jesus right now in this text. Just as some of us were, say, in this room a month and a half ago at Ron Kinch's memorial service, or at Tom Heathorn's at CPC a couple weeks ago. So the question is, what do we learn? What's our takeaway? What is God impressing upon my heart and my soul and my mind? What can we glean from this testimony? In this case, of the story itself of Jesus' death. I want to offer 3 small, somewhat obvious insights that we can glean that let our minds and our souls kind of ruminate on this as we leave the memorial service today and we kind of walk to our cars. As I left Tom Heathorn's, I was walking to my car and there were 2 things on my mind. I remember it just like it was yesterday, and it was only 2 weeks ago, but still I can remember it so clearly. One was, what did I learn? And the second one was, gosh, I wish I could just interact with his one son for just a moment, and I've never met him. And right in front of me, there he was. That's what I want to do this morning in this remaining time. So let me just mention and briefly explain 3 thoughts. First of all, you have no idea what the Spirit is doing when you are not watching. In fact, I would go so far as to say we don't know what he's doing half the time when we're watching. When you leave chapter 3, there is 0, and I mean 0 sign that Nicodemus moves. In fact, I would argue you would come to the conclusion that Nicodemus hasn't budged. He's stiff-necked, he's skeptical, he's seemingly annoyed. I mean, listen to the interaction in John 3. Jesus answered Nicodemus, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." Nicodemus said to him, "How can a man be born when he's old?" Translation, that's ridiculous, you don't make any sense, and that's just stupid. That's Doug's inflection. Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? He knows the answer to that question. This is not a real question. This is a rhetorical question. Jesus gives this big, thorough, beautiful explanation, by the way, after this. And listen to how Nicodemus responds. Nicodemus said to him, "How can these things be?" He looks totally unmoved. But here's the deal. He is. My dad died on Thanksgiving. On Sunday, so 3 days later, Linda and I are at home. We get a call. It's from Kristen and Eric Sutherland, who many of you know. Their whole family, a lot of their family went to church here. They moved to Montana, I don't know, a dozen years ago. Very, very close friends. They were out at their family ranch for Thanksgiving, so they knew my dad passed because we had sent them a text and sent them a video from the day my dad died. And so when they finally got back into town, they immediately called Linda and I. They just wanted to talk to us and grieve with us and process with us. And Kristen shared something with me that was like, wow. She said her dad, Hap, many of you know Hap and Gail Parks because they were just stalwarts in this church, godly people. And what had happened was, when my dad died, I had asked Linda, I guess I need to tell this part of the story, I had asked Linda to grab my bagpipes that I learned during COVID. Learned, that's kind of a stretch, but I've learned a little bit. And and I didn't explain to her, she never asked me, and long story short, everybody was in the house, and as they were taking my dad's body out and putting it in the van, I went to the top of the hill, and I played Amazing Grace, because I wanted the Trinity to make sure they knew who was coming. And I wanted to send my dad off in a way a godly man should be sent off. And I didn't tell anybody in the family, and they couldn't even hear me, which is great. It was just between me and the 3 of them, Father, Son, and Spirit, and my dad, quite frankly. Well, somebody spotted me, and they all came outside, and they videoed it, unbeknownst to me. Well, Linda sent this to Kristen and Eric. And Kristen played this video for Hap, and Hap just started to sob. And it was shocking to me when she told me. And Hap's other son-in-law, Joel, said, I don't mean to speak out of turn, but Hap, I'm confused. Why? I mean, I see why it's sad to you and moving, but why is this hitting you so hard? Hap said, "Oh, you don't understand." He said, "I came to Christ at Bible Study Fellowship. Norm was my teacher." Isn't that? My dad has no idea. Now he does. I got a Chris Trapani. Is Chris in the house? There he is. Chris sends me these text emails. I don't even know how he does it. It's a text in an email. I'm sorry, I must be getting old. My VCR clock is blinking. I don't even know how he does this. And I opened it up and I read this, and it was the most moving, sweet thing. He said, Doug, you don't know this, but Norm was my teacher. Norm was my teacher. And when I went to pick a church, he said, listen to this. I saw your name, and that's why I came here. That's it. My dad has no idea. See, many, many times I have sat before God, right? And I hope this resonates with you. But I've literally said, has this made any difference? Has this mattered what I've done? Or maybe you pour your life into somebody or try to help them, or you spend time with them, you serve them and whatever. And at the end of the day, you sit back and you go, has this mattered? Haven't we all experienced that with somebody or somebodies? Has it mattered? But, and I have said this many times, and it needs to be said many, many more times, our life is about being faithful to whatever God asks, no matter how weird it is, Amethyst, no matter how ridiculous it is, no matter whether we can see the connection to the kingdom. When he asks, we do it. Our life is not about success. Success is a worldly word. That got quiet. We're about faithfulness. This church is the same size and number, maybe a little less than when I started 12 years ago. And through the years, occasionally when people don't know us and don't know me, they'll say something, they'll ask me a question. And I've shared this before, I think. And it's a terrible question. And 12 years ago, it made me kind of wiggle a little bit. Now I think it's humorous. What is the size of your church? That's what they ask me. What's behind that question? Have you been successful? God's response, who cares? That's my problem, Doug, not yours. Mike Yaconelli, I've mentioned him from up front. He's written he wrote several cool little books. Messy Spirituality is a great read. He was a nationally known youth worker, total hippie, whiskey drinking, cigar smoking, Jesus loving, Harley riding dude in Weed, California. You know where Weed is? Probably not. And he used to describe his church as the slowest growing church in America. 30 people. People would fall asleep. He had people that had some mental issues that would just shout stuff in the middle of his sermon. People would come to visit because Mike Yaconelli was kind of known, and they go, okay, this is too weird for me. I'm getting out of here. Slowest growing church in America. But he did what God wanted. My image for being faithful to God that God kind of gave me when my dad passed was, I think our life is like sitting by the shores of Lake Tahoe. And we've got a little palm full of pebbles. And we take one, and it's glassy. There's not a lick of wind. And we toss one in the water. And in about 4 seconds, the ripple is non-existent to the eye. But this is what God asks us to do. Just keep tossing your pebble. You have no idea where the reverberation is going to hit. Pete Stafford and Sally went here for years as well. Godly couple. Pete told me, the guy that had one of the greatest impacts on me is the last guy that knows it. He was my junior high youth pastor. No idea the effect he had on me. And now Pete leads a men's study at a church over in Walnut Creek with 50, 60 guys with Mike Sheedy. Nicodemus gave almost no indication he was being transformed, but he was. John 19:39. Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight. And you say, that sounds like a lot. That is a lot. For reference, this is 100 times what Mary poured over Jesus in Bethany. Remember when she anointed Jesus? 100 times that amount. Do you remember what they said about Mary's extravagant gift? It's a waste, and it's worth a year's wages. It's a waste. 100 times Nicodemus brings. This amount, by the way, that Nicodemus uses is what you would use to bury a king. Isn't that awesome? In quantity and quality. Nicodemus was changed by the gospel. And you have no idea, by the way, what your impact is. And for the most part, you don't need to know. Every now and then, I think God peels the curtain back and he'll say, okay, I'm going to let you peek so you can see that you're having an effect. And now I'm going to close it real quick because you know what you're going to do? You're going to focus on that and not being faithful. So let me just show you because I'm super kind and I love you and I want to encourage you. Boom, that's enough. Don't stare. Jesus said to him what he said and he let it alone. Just keep your head down, listen to his call, and just do it. Nike has no idea what that means. Keep walking. My dad never once tried to measure his life. Not once. He was too busy doing what Jesus asked. Number 2, told you these are going to be personal. Our walk is a developing walk, and I also told you they're going to be very obvious. What do I mean by that? You can measure Nicodemus 2 different ways, and you can come to 2 totally different conclusions, I think. In chapter 3, I love what it says. Listen to this. Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night. Do I need to know that? Does it matter? Well, maybe it just means it was night. I don't think that's why John's telling us that. He's scared. There's 0 boldness to this guy in chapter 3. He doesn't want anybody to know he's even talking to Jesus. And as soon as I saw that, I remembered what Jesus said in Luke 9, "For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed, when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and the glory of his holy angels." Yikes. And just in case we miss it, by the way, listen to what John says in 19. Nicodemus also, who earlier, by the way, just to remind you, had come by night. Now, why do I need to know that again? John is making sure we don't miss the point. Man, what a wimp. Right? The same with Joseph of Arimathea. Listen to what it says. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews. Kind of makes you feel all justified, judgy inside, doesn't it? I read that and I go, gosh, man, I'm doing great. These 2 guys suck. Not so fast. And yet, what does Nicodemus do? What does Joseph of Arimathea do? Let me finish that verse, by the way. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission, so he came and took away the body. Nicodemus also. He and Joseph of Arimathea go to Pilate. To Pilate, the Roman governor of all of Judea, who just sentenced Jesus to be crucified to death. The person who will be totally suspicious, who might arrest any sympathizer and kill them on the spot. They know the danger, and they absolutely do not care. And that isn't all, by the way. They personally anoint the body, which was gross. It was smelly and awful. It was a demeaning process. And I'm only saying this because culturally it's what was done. Hopefully, we're a little more advanced in this now. This was what the women did, by the way. Men did not do this in this time. And on top of that, it made these 2 of the 71 sages totally unholy. They don't care about their station. They are 2 of the 71 sages in all of Judea, and they don't care. They're bold, and they're humble, and they're changed. They're serving and loving. They're courageous. And here it is. And they're afraid. Right? What was your phrase? Say it again. Do it afraid. But they're moving forward. They kept moving even despite their fear. My nephew, Tyler, he's the oldest of all my mom and dad's grandkids. He's in his 40s now. Great dude. He lives in Santa Cruz. We're super close. He found out my dad had a day or 2 left, so Wednesday, he says to his wife, Tina, I'm going to shoot up, which was strange because he was already coming for Thanksgiving on Thursday, but Wednesday evening, he said, I'm going, and Tina said, I'm going with you, and all 3 of his teenage kids said, we're going too, Dad. So they all 5 piled in the car. They drove up from Santa Cruz, and he just wanted to spend time with my dad before he passed. My dad was not responsive at that point, but he just wanted to hold his hand one more time. And then he came down to our house, and we ordered some food, and we just sat at the counter. And Tyler and I just were processing, knowing my dad was probably going to be gone that night. And Tyler had this amazing statement. He said, and he's really loud and strong and boisterous, and everything comes out just like 100 miles an hour when he says it. And he said, the thing about Grandpa? And I said, no, Tyler, tell me the thing about Grandpa. He said he always stayed in his lane. Isn't that a great line? He meant a lot by that, by the way. He never took an exit. He was like, you know what, I just need a little me time. And by the way, we do need that. We do need to pull out of life. That's what Jesus did. But he just stayed in the lane. Now, he clanked some cars in that lane, I will tell you. He clanked my car many times in that lane. And he never stopped in that lane. He just fumbled forward because Jesus was right with him in that car, saying, keep on going, Norm. Keep on going for the kingdom. We so want to measure people where they are rather than where they came from. May we have the grace to look at people's lives and realize the hole they're crawling out of with Christ. And that goes for us too. And finally, does your faith inform you? Can you see in your life what you say you learn in activated movement? I've been teaching for a long time. I started teaching 6 months after I started walking with God, which is just ridiculous, but that's what I did. I discipled 2 guys that summer. And for 40 years, I've been discipling and counseling and teaching and mentoring and speaking up front. And that's a lot of talks, by the way. And so invariably, it's always so awkward. When a guy finishes teaching and the service gets done, and then that guy comes by you, don't you feel like should I say something? He was up there for 35 minutes. There's no need, by the way. But it's super kind, and people say every now and then, like, oh, that was really good, or thank you, or beautiful. And I love it. It's really, really kind. I don't know what to do with it, because it's like, they're his words. I'm just trying to make sense of them. His spirit's moving. I really am doing nothing other than standing up here, and then I'm Geppetto, and he moves me, or Pinocchio, I mean. But, yeah, that was the wrong illustration. But what really moves me is when somebody says, here's how it changed me. This is why it mattered. Do you work to change your own thinking? Do the people around you see the heartfelt change in your life as a result of what Jesus is saying? Does your faith inform your feet? Or do you just keep hearing good stuff? But there's no change. I preached on the removal of shame a few weeks ago. What effect did that have on you? Last week, it was amazing. I got done with the sermon, and after the end of the sermon was on how this is our true family. I don't know if you remember that, but this is our highest form of family because this is the blood of Christ. This is way higher than earthly family, which is hard to take in because we can be so close to some family members. And after the service, and I won't say who, I want to, but I won't. I'll be good. I saw these two couples talking, and I found out later that the one gal was so moved by it, she said, you know what? I'm not doing enough on my part to build community with the people that God has given to me. So she was setting up a monthly dinner already with these other couples. Still in this room. I mean, still warm from the service, by the way, is the way I would say it. Like, that is what I'm talking about. Nicodemus and Joseph, even though they were totally scared, they let Jesus move them to change. May we be the same. May our lives be a constant movement, dumping our box of rocks out and allowing Jesus to put only that which belongs back in the box back. Listen to what he prompts you with. Listen to what he prods you with. And by the way, there's only two voices in this world besides yours, the enemy's and Christ's. When you get a word, when you get a voice, when you get a prodding that says, go love this person, I can tell you that's not the enemy. So accept it, receive it as a word from God. And just move. And don't measure it. Don't worry about whether it worked. Who cares? It's not your problem. Success is not your problem. What a great gig. Like, you have this job in the kingdom, and success is literally not even on the table. Who wouldn't love this? But you have it. So move into it. Let's pray. Jesus, you are our success. You are our righteousness. You are our obedience. You are our redemption, our forgiveness, our purification, our cleansing. Everything we have is from you. It's ridiculous that you let us participate with you, but thank you for not patting us on the head like a dog. Thank you for calling us priests, holy priests in your kingdom to reach a dark, dying world. Ministering to each other, to keep going, to keep moving, to keep listening, to realize that we can be wrong because you're right. And your rightness is upon us if we've given our life to you. Would you make these people more courageous? Spirit, would you infuse them with your boldness, with your kindness, with your mercy? Would you help us hear you better, as Ron began to teach us this morning? And may we honor you as we move into this time of communion. And all God's people said, amen.